Hello, my name is Mike Bushermo. I am a professor and the Precision Ag Specialist with UT Extension. Grain bin entrapment. Don't let this happen to you. When you are loading, unloading, or moving grain from bin to bin, you need to know the hazards of flowing grain and how to prevent grain bin accidents. The following is a true story told by a producer that got trapped in flowing grain. We were emptying a bin of corn and the grain suddenly stopped flowing. I went inside the bin to check it out, and my brother stayed outside by the unloading auger. I didn't think there was that much corn left in the bin. Crusted grain had clogged the unloading gate. I stood to one side and poked at the pile with a rod. The auger was still running, so grain started flowing again. Before I knew it, I was trapped in the grain. Once it got above my knees, I couldn't move. It all happened so fast. I began sinking, and soon I was up to my chest in grain. I threw corn at the wall and yelled. Fortunately, my brother heard me and shut off the auger. My brother came in and started shoveling corn to free me. It was a waste of time. More corn ran back in as he shoveled it. Finally, he called for help. 2 township fire departments arrived and used a rescue tube to get me out of the grain. After I was rescued, I realized how fortunate I was to be alive. If I had stopped to think before I went in the bin, with the auger still running, this would have never happened. Too many times we don't stop to think. We just focus on the job we need to do and don't think about anything else. Fortunately, this producer survived and he was able to tell his story. Unfortunately, many don't survive when they get entrapped in flowing grain. With the increase in the number of grain storage facilities being built on the farm, grain entrapments have risen by over 65% over the last 3 years. Historically, around 75% of all documented victims of grain bin entrapment and engulfment have been farmers, farm employees, and farm family members. Approximately 1 in 5 grain entrapments involve children. More than half of those that become entrapped in grain do not survive. Grain bin accidents, either from entrapment or engulfment, are reminders that grain storage, especially flowing grain, is very dangerous. Entrapment is when you become buried in the grain beyond the point of you being able to get out on your own. Engulfment is when you are completely buried or submerged beneath the surface of the grain. Unfortunately, in many cases, grain entrapment leads to engulfment, which is always fatal. You can become caught or trapped in grain in 3 different ways: entrapment in flowing grain, the collapse of bridge grain, and the collapse of a vertical wall of grain. Moving or flowing grain is involved in all 3 cases. The most common way producers get caught or trapped in a grain bin is when the grain is flowing. Around 80% of the reported grain engulfment accidents involve someone that was inside a bin when grain unloading equipment was running. When unloading conveyors or augers remove grain from the bottom of a bin, grain directly above the outlet moves rapidly to fill this void. This causes a funnel-shaped flow to develop on the top surface of the grain, much like quicksand. If you are standing on this flowing grain, your weight forces the grain supporting you to flow faster to the outlet. This causes you to rapidly sink into the grain. A 6-foot-tall person will sink into flowing grain past their knees in less than 5 seconds. If the unloading equipment is not shut off, you can become completely engulfed in less than 20 seconds. Once you become entrapped, the pressure and the friction forces applied by the grain on your body are so strong you cannot swim, climb, or walk against it or get out on your own. The force applied by grain on your body is far greater than most people realize. The force required to lift someone buried below the surface of the grain can easily exceed 2,000 pounds. This is about the same force you would need to lift a small car. While most entrapments occur in grain bins, they can also occur in any vehicle used to transport grain. Vehicles used to transport grain come in many shapes and sizes, but their main purpose is to move grain from one point to another. These vehicles include gravity wagons, trucks, and large bulk semi-trailers. As with grain bins, entrapment in grain transport vehicles occur when they are being loaded or unloaded, most entrapments occurring during unloading. When grain transport vehicles are being unloaded, the grain flows similar to grain in a bin. Again, the flowing grain is similar to quicksand and can quickly engulf you and result in entrapment and suffocation. Sadly, many unfarmed grain engulfment accidents involve gravity flow wagons and young children. Children are shorter and become submerged quicker than adults. They also do not have the physical strength to pull themselves out of grain before they become entrapped. Another way you can get entrapped in grain is from the collapse of bridged grain. Spoiled or out of condition grain can become moldy and harden into a crust-like mass. This crust can form on the surface or anywhere in the grain mass. Cavities or pockets are created when dry or loose grain is unloaded by the auger and the hardened or crusted grain does not move. This crust and the cavity below it is commonly referred to as a grain bridge. This grain bridge oftentimes appears solid, but they are very unstable and not strong enough to support the weight of a person. When you walk along this crust, the bridge collapses and you instantly fall into the cavity below. It can be difficult to locate you when this type of entrapment occurs because a large amount of grain can suddenly flow and completely engulf you in an instant. If unloading equipment is running at the time this occurs, you can become rapidly pulled down toward the bottom of the bin. The third way you can get entrapped in grain is from the collapse of a vertical mass of grain along the bin wall. Spoiled grain can form a clumped mass that adheres to the vertical wall of a grain bin. After you empty the bin, you may be faced with a wall of crusted grain that must be broken free before it can be unloaded. If the wall of grain is taller than you when standing on the grain bin floor, an avalanche can occur as you try to break up this crusted wall of grain with shovels, poles, or other objects. There is no warning when this crusted wall of grain breaks loose and flows down on you. The impact will knock you off your feet and bury you instantly. 1 foot of grain on top of you weighs approximately 300 pounds. This is normally too much weight for anyone to unbury themselves. Following these safety tips can help you prevent grain bin accidents from occurring on the farm. The best way to prevent grain bin accidents is to eliminate the reason for entering a bin in the first place. The most common reason accident victims enter a grain bin is to address problems that result from spoiled grain. Properly managing stored grain is the key to preventing grain spoilage. Always inspect bins before the harvest season to identify and fix any leaks. Store grain at the correct moisture content and temperature to prevent conditions favorable for grain to spoil and clump together. Run aeration fans to properly control grain temperature throughout the entire storage period, and monitor the grain regularly for pests, off odors, hot spots, and moisture content to detect any storage problems early. Another safety tip is to always work from outside the bin whenever possible. If clumps or crust develop in the grain, use a pole from outside the bin to probe or knock the clump free. Never enter a grain bin alone. Always use the buddy system when you are unloading or loading grain. For your safety, someone must be aware of your presence in the bin. Make sure your buddy knows where you are at all times so they can get help if needed. If you must enter a bin, make sure you wear a full body harness tethered to a lifeline that is manned by 2 others from outside the bin. One worker should watch you inside the bin through the access door. The other worker can get help in the event of an accident. Anytime you enter a grain bin, be aware of constantly changing conditions and possible hazards, like low oxygen levels and the presence of any toxic gases, all of which can cause serious injury or death. Toxic gases can be present from fumigants that are used to prevent insect infestation while grain is stored in the bins. Always wear a respirator capable of filtering fine dust materials to avoid any unnecessary exposure to molds and dust. Safety tip is to lock out all power to unloading augers before entering a bin. There is no reason to enter a grain bin with loading and unloading equipment running. Be sure the power has been turned off and loading and unloading equipment is not running. Power to the unloading equipment should be turned off, locked and tagged so that no one else can start any grain handling equipment, or an automatic timer doesn't start the equipment while you are inside the bin. A lockout tagout system will ensure your safety. Another important tip is to restrict access to grain storage bins. Be sure to lock access doors so unauthorized persons, bystanders, and children cannot enter. Post signs at all entry points that warns of potential hazards. Only workers that have been properly trained should be allowed to enter the bin. It is especially important to keep children off of grain transport vehicles and out of grain bins during loading and unloading. Grain flow can quickly cover them before they realize what is happening. It is important to provide training to all farm workers on the dangers of flowing grain. Train workers on grain storage hazards and risks involved with loading, unloading, or entering a grain storage bin. Training should include recognizing grain quality problems, proper entry procedures, use of safety equipment, and what to do or who to call in case of an emergency response. Training should be provided at regular intervals, not just upon hiring or once a year. It's also important to have an emergency rescue plan in place and follow it. Make specific accident response plans with employees and anyone who frequently works around the facility, such as a contract hauler. This plan should include having cell phones on site and phone numbers posted for local emergency responders trained in bin rescue. By working together as a team, more of the risks and dangers will be identified and more practical solutions can be taken in the case of a grain bin accident. If you use a team approach, the potential of entrapment or engulfment is almost eliminated. What should you do if someone gets trapped? In the event of a flowing grain entrapment, the following steps should be taken. Shut off all unloading equipment. Call 911. Prevent anyone from entering the bin until trained emergency response personnel arrive. If the bin has an aeration fan, turn it on to increase the airflow through the bin to help the entrapped person breathe. And finally, assemble equipment for assistance with a rescue, including front-end loaders, shovels, plywood for cofferdams, and portable augers. Grain bin accidents from entrapment or engulfment are reminders that grain storage, especially flowing grain, can become very dangerous. It is important to always remember these safety tips. Manage grain to prevent spoilage. Remember, the most common reason accident victims enter a grain bin is to address problems that result from spoiled grain. Do not enter a grain bin that is being loaded or unloaded. Flowing grain can trap and suffocate you in seconds. If it is necessary to enter a bin, shut off and lock out power to all grain handling equipment before entering. Use a safety harness and a safety line. Have several people available outside the bin in case of an emergency. Wear dust filtering respirators when working inside a grain bin. High amounts of dust and molds could be present and are extremely dangerous. Restrict access to grain storage bins. Label grain bins to warn of entrapment hazards. Keep bystanders and children away from grain bins and grain handling equipment. Have an emergency rescue plan in place and follow it. It is important to review safety procedures with all workers, family, and visitors. Don't let a grain storage or handling accident happen to you, a farm worker, or a member of your family. Remember, it only takes less than 5 seconds to be submerged to the point of where you can't get out by yourself. And it takes less than 20 seconds to be completely submerged in flowing grain. Don't let this happen on your farm. You need to know the risks. I hope this presentation will enable you to prevent a grain entrapment accident on your farm. Please feel free to contact me at mbusher@utk.edu if you have any questions or need any additional information. You must take and pass the Grain Bin Entrapment Don't Let This Happen to You quiz to receive Master Row Crop credit. You can find the link to this quiz at masterrowcrop.tennessee.edu.